modern idea that Vikings threw their axe is a misconception. If you look at the physics of an axe, they're very poorly suited for throwing in combat. I'm Dr. William Short. I'm an independent scholar focusing on scientific research of Vikings, particularly Viking combat. Today we're going to look at Viking battles in movies and TV and judge how real they are. Throws it right back. And that is mentioned numerous times in the literary sources as being a very effective battle technique. And we've tested it, and it works great. It's really not so difficult to catch the spear in flight and throw it back. The nature of berserkers are still a little bit mysterious, but they are people who enter a battle frenzy before a battle, and the sources say they howl like wolves, they bite their shields, and iron and fire cannot harm them. Vikings didn't use stone castles or anything like that. A typical enclosure would be a wood palisade fence. And climbing it with an axe seems very doable, using the axe to pull yourself up. And we've done a lot of research on the physics of these weapons, doing motion capture, measuring historic weapons, using computer models to study it. And what the axe has over some of the other weapons is just this insane amount of power. In one of our measurements, at the moment the two-handed axe hits the target, it just destroys what it touches. And that's how Vikings used it. So the weapon that Amleth is using in this clip once he enters the village is a sax. And before he enters, you can see that it's slung horizontally from his belt. A sax was a short sword. What the sax is a chopping weapon, and he's holding it upside down in a strange way and uses it for a slice, and that's not what the weapon is meant for at all. And destroying things with fire was just a way to emphasize the terror of these kinds of raids. We've done some tests where we actually built Viking houses, instrumented them, game, knattleikr, a little bit off. We play it almost every year. Our research suggests that it's something quite different than what you see on the screen. So in the clip we see 5 versus 5, but in Viking times it's pretty clear that it was one-on-one. People were carefully matched to be about the same strength. You see a lot of running in this clip. The sources suggest running was not a part of the game at all. The game was really about power. It wasn't about speed. In the sources, when people talk about the games, they don't say that this team won or this team won. It's always this particular individual was stronger than his opponent. This one was stronger than this one. I give the creative team that made this film a lot of credit for doing deep research and really getting things right about Viking culture and Viking society. I would rate this as a 9. There are some things a little off, but there are so many things that are just perfect that I can't give it any less. This kind of sneaking up on the castle, probably not. Vikings were pretty direct about what they did. Now, they did use ambushes quite a bit. That was a very standard battle technique, but it was very different. What you do is get intelligence about where your enemy was going to be and when, and you'd go there and wait for them with a superior force. It's not like you jump out of the bushes or sneak up on them. You just wait, and when they arrive, you start fighting. The shield wall we see in this clip and numerous others really do not depict the shield wall as it was used in the Viking Age. The shield wall, the ancient word is skjaldborg, is mainly meant to protect against projectiles so that the king could observe and issue his orders, and then it would be taken down and continue the fight. The shield wall was meant to be a defensive structure thrown up temporarily, then taken down again. So having archers behind the shield wall, probably not so likely. Having archers further back from the front of the lines, definitely. That was very much a thing. So what they're using here is some sort of boom chain, something stretched across the river that's underwater until the last moment and can be pulled up to stop the ship at the appropriate moment. Now, even in Viking lands, these kinds of underwater obstacles were used, especially around trading towns, and try to minimize the possibility that raiders might attack the trading towns, because trading towns were very desirable targets for raiders. A lot of wealth. So chains, underwater obstacles such as posts and booms that were held below the water's surface, all of these were used. They're lifting their ships over the mountains and dropping them on the other side so they could sail to Paris. That's not a Viking approach at all. That's way off. They just sailed up the river. Viking ships were the technological marvel of their age that Vikings had and other European lands did not have. And one of the advantages of their ships is they were very shallow draft. They didn't need much water to float the ship. And so sailing up the river to Paris was no problem for them. Now, we know that Vikings did portage their ships, especially in the river systems of Eastern Europe, when they sailed on trading voyages from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. It seems likely that the way they would portage a ship over land is with wooden rollers, just dragging it, probably mostly by human power, maybe with horses. I think I would rate this 4. The Vikings TV show uses historical people, names of people, historical places, but a lot of the details seem to transpire in this what-if fantasy world where people with Viking names have been dropped into something that's not very Viking. If we believe the myths, that battle would be over in about a half second. Loki was scared to death of Thor because he knew Thor would pulverize him. So in the instances where Thor issued a challenge, Loki quickly backed off. Yeah, so the Warhammer would not have been a thing in the Viking Age, except, of course, for Thor's Mjolnir, his special hammer. Numerous mentions of him smashing the skulls of his enemies with it. Numerous mentions of him throwing it. But it had additional magical properties. It could bring the dead back to life. Now, in the world of humans, these kind of warhammers don't appear until way after the end of the Viking Age, late medieval and Renaissance, in a response to warriors starting to use plate armor for their defense. So they use these long, long warhammers to try to smash through the armor. I would give this a 3. The name is right. A few of the aspects are right, but most of it is kind of far off based on what we know of Thor, Loki. The axe had a very specific purpose in battle. This is a replica, and what it's intended to do is to split in two whatever it touches. What the sword has over the axe, the sword has maneuverability. You can change its trajectory as you're targeting. So if one target changes or becomes unavailable as the sword is in motion, you can retarget it and hit something else. With a two-handed axe, you can't do that. Once you set it in motion, it's going to hit. And the analogy we like to use is a sword is like a nuclear-tipped guided missile. You know that it's going to destroy what it hits, but you can retarget it after it's been launched in flight. But an axe is like an asteroid plunging through the atmosphere, hitting the earth, destroying everything, and killing the dinosaurs. The axe is a cutting weapon, quite simple. And using it in any other way than to cleave in two what's in front of it is probably an ineffective use of the weapon. And we see that in the clip, that a lot of hits with the butt, a lot of strange uses of the axe. I don't think a Viking would typically do that. So in a fight, they would want to apply pressure, 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 pressure. We do see examples of Vikings fighting with different weapons in each hand. But it's not common. Much more typical would be a weapon in one hand, shield in the other. And the shields were the primary defense of Vikings. Someone without a shield was thought to be defenseless. Viking duels were highly formalized forms of one-on-one combat with a strict set of laws and a strict set of methods for doing it. It was one-on-one combat where you could not move. The two fighters stood stationary during the fight, and it was trading blows. So first the challenged man did an attack on the challenger, then the challenger did an attack on the challenged man. And this continued until either somebody died or the first blood spilled on the ground below them. And duelers brought 3 shields with them to the dueling site because they knew it was likely that a shield would break. And so if a shield broke, they'd throw it away and pick up a fresh one during the duel. So what we see in this clip is a shield being swung around wildly like, a knuckle duster. We don't have evidence that Vikings did that very much. The shield was a defense, and any other use was probably sort of last ditch. So in the Viking Age, shields were round, made of wood, with an iron boss in the center, and you grip the shield from behind the boss. There's a grip back there. There's no straps that the arm passes through, so the shield can rotate pretty freely. Now, the shield in actual use was a defense. You held it tight to the body, and that is to allow you to deliver powerful blows with your sword. Now, it's possible to have the shield swinging around, but in order to deliver a blow with the shield way out here, you're wide open for a possible counterattack as you're delivering the strike. I would call both of those sort of standard Hollywood stereotypical fights. You could take away the Viking clothing, take away the Viking weapons, and substitute clothing and weapons from some other culture, and the fight on the screen would be exactly the same. Their attacks were relentless, trying to achieve this austere, this word glory. You might kill your enemy with a slice or a jab, but that wouldn't give you this word glory. What would give you word glory is by splitting your opponent in two. So they were looking for these powerful attacks. And that kind of mindset really seems to be missing in this clip. So I would rate this clip about 4 for realism.
When we crack this mountain open, all hell is going to break loose.
Now, one thing that this film surprisingly gets absolutely right is the formations that were used in these battles. You can see them sketching it in the sand. Vikings didn't use lines across the battlefield that advanced, as we often see in these clips, but rather they used columns. So in the sketch, we have 3 columns that are advancing, and that would be very typically the Viking way. There's actually extremely limited evidence that Vikings used catapults. And the projectiles Vikings preferred were, of course, arrows, spears, and the king of Viking weapons, stones.
Beard of Thor! What is that?
The strongest and most capable fighters would be at the very tip, along with the person holding the battle standard. So this would be the king's hirth, his bodyguard, his prized fighters. Also with him would be his berserks. It's very likely that Viking kings had levy armies. In other words, farmers who were trained in the use of weapons, that had weapons available to them, who were required to come and serve the king in battle when called, when danger came to their land. They're wearing very stereotypical Viking helmets with horns. And there's just absolutely no evidence that Viking helmets had horns. We really wish they did, because that would be so cool. Way before the Viking Age, there's pictorial sources that show ceremonial helmets that did have elaborate horns. But that wasn't Viking. The typical Viking helmet was a simple bowl with some sort of guard over the front of the face.
Where did Hiccup go wrong?
He showed up.
He didn't get eaten.
He's never where he should be.
Thank you, Astrid.
Viking houses were long and narrow. They were called longhouses for a reason. So the expansive room that we see in this clip was probably not typical for Vikings. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this clip is the young boy is sort of wandering around looking for a place to sit, and that was not at all the Viking way. Your seating position was chosen for you by the master or mistress of the hall, and you did not change. Young children were at the very bottom, so the boy would probably be sitting at the far end, either end of the house, far from the light, far from the heat, and maybe even sitting on the floor. I would give this clip a 4. In the clip, we see someone, a warrior, wearing mail armor. And the universal defense would have been a shield. Virtually everyone carried a shield. And if they had anything more than that, it was probably much less likely. So it would be someone at the level of the king or the king's men. A mail shirt is exceedingly difficult to make in terms of time. The typical mail shirt might easily have 30,000 rings. Each one has to be riveted shut around its neighboring rings to form the fabric. Viking warriors expected that their shields might break. They were considered expendable. So they were round, they were made of wood, so wood planks, and there's an iron boss in the center. Typical shields were quite a bit bigger than this, even as much as 36 inches. So in our test, just one hit with a two-handed axe to a shield destroyed it. So in one case, the shields are limp and loose down by the side, and that would not be typical for a Viking shield. You'd really want it tight and close to your body to provide the defense you need, while still allowing you to use your weapon hand for delivering powerful blows. And then in the other instance, he is holding it close to the body. That's essential for absorbing and deflecting the force of that weapon. I would rate this clip around 3. It's very much in a fantasy world with some fantasy weapons and fantastic elements going on. There's two main categories of Viking ships. Merchant ships were meant to be primarily powered by sail and only occasionally by oar coming into land. Warships, on the other hand, were designed to be rowed fairly routinely. So they were extremely efficient in their design so that the rowers could get high speeds and they didn't tire themselves on long trips while rowing. The warships were long and narrow. This one that we see in the clip, I'd say the proportions are a little bit off, but a lot of the details are more or less correct. Now, the thing that was way off was rowing the Viking ship. What we see in the clip, these people don't scarcely have their oars in the water. They're not going to be able to deliver much power in the stroke. And they're not putting their body into it. My organization, Herstwick, has done some experiments with rowing a Viking ship and tried several different rowing styles to see which was the most efficient. And so based on our measurements, this long, slow stroke that uses the low muscles of the body was the one that gave 30% more speed to the ship than any other stroke we tested. And also the rowers reported that at the end of each run, that was the one that was the least fatiguing.
Now comes the true test.
Surviving archaeological examples of Viking ships have material, equipment outboard of the hull. And if you come up to a pier or a dock, that stuff will just get ripped right off. So it seems unlikely that Viking ships were routinely brought up to a pier or dock. And the typical way of landing a Viking ship was just simply sail it up onto a sandy beach. And we even see evidence of that in the surviving archaeological examples. The keel is rubbed by sand. Yeah, I would give this clip a rating of 4. The costumes are wrong. The armor that we see is wrong. The rowing is wrong. At least the ship is okay. This hail of arrows was something that Vikings did. They would have called it driva, like literally a hail of arrows falling down on the opponents. And this film clip seems to show that pretty nicely, this intense hailstorm of arrows. What's a bit off is how the archers are using their bows. Now, we don't know a lot about the bows of the Viking Age. Because they're made of wood, they disintegrate. Almost every single pictorial source from the Viking Age, not only from Viking lands, but other lands as well, shows a very different style of drawing the bow. We think of like modern competitive archers or the Robin Hood style of archers. You pull the arrow back to your head. All the pictorial sources show them drawing the arrow down to their hip. And so I would have hoped to have seen something like that. The modern idea that Vikings threw their axe is a misconception. If you look at the physics of an axe, they're very poorly suited for throwing in combat. And so in the Viking world, it would have been a last resort. The axe spins as it flies, so there's only a very small moment when the axe is in the right position to hit the target. In terms of cutting a rope with a sword, oh, that's no problem at all. Just a single stroke will do it. In order to test them, we want to use a stand-in for human flesh and bone, and the best stand-in we've been able to find is animal carcasses, typically pig carcasses. So we'll do test cuts with replica sharp weapons against a pig carcass to see if the weapon cuts the way we expect, to see if we see the same marks on the skeleton that we see in the skeletal remains from the Viking Age. These things are highly destructive. I would give this clip a rating of 5. The details of the archery and the draw were probably off, but that flight of arrows was realized on the screen beautifully. It probably looked very much like that. And that is not how Viking ships were intended to be used, especially the warships. They would just sail up onto the beach, the warriors would jump over and be ready to fight. Literally instantly. And because the ships were so shallow draft, they knew that if they just jumped overboard, they would not be in any water any deeper than their knees. So Vikings did transport their horses by sea, but not in any way like what is shown in this clip. What we see in the clip is warships, and warships simply had no room for horses. If horses had to be transported, they'd be transported in merchant ships. More importantly, Vikings did not carry horses with them for war. They were sea people. If they arrived on land and needed a horse to ride to battle, they'd just steal one. In a battle, they dismounted and fought on foot. You're not going to achieve this word glory, killing someone on horseback. You're going to do it by standing in front of them and splitting them in two.
King John saith it there!
When the warriors raise the weapons over their heads, we can see a variety of weapons that are far removed from what we would have seen in the Viking Age. Two-edged axe, that was not used in the Viking Age at all, and not even in later medieval times when the film apparently was set. We see some really strange pole weapons, almost halberd-like, that would have not come into the battlefield until centuries later. We see some swords that have proportions more like a katana than a Viking sword or a medieval European sword. It's not like the king had some particularly gigantic axe and everyone else had something smaller. I just think it depended more on what the individual warrior wanted. All has to do with penetration power. So a really short head is going to penetrate deeper with the same level of swing, and a longer head a little bit more, but it also gives you more flexibility in targeting too if the edge is longer. The other aspect is the shape can also be used defensively for hooking. Our tests in simulated combat suggest that the hooking shape is indeed a valuable defense. This clip, I think I would rate a 3. The weapons are wrong. The use of the ship is way wrong. Just many things are off. This kind of shield wall is much more like a Roman testudo. So something that covers over the top, something that people move in, something that's at the front of the line. We know of 2 battle formations they used. One is the shield wall, skjaldborg. The other formation that I'd like to mention is the boar snout, and Vikings use that only rarely, and the descriptions of it vary from place to place. But again, they'd form into a wedge shape, and it would be used to drive their way through the opponent. And so I don't see either of those formations in this clip. If one of the opposing fighters actually was able to approach the shield wall with a sword, the battle was essentially over. What we see here where they're hacking much over the top of the shield, it's something really common in the reenactor world. One more thing that's completely missing from this clip. We have good descriptions of mass battles between Vikings and Vikings, but also between Vikings and other cultures, such as the Anglo-Saxons. And these battles always start with projectiles, and I didn't see any projectiles being thrown in this clip. I would rate this clip a 4. Some of the weapons we see are off, and the clothing is just dull and boring, and Vikings weren't like that. So they're all dirty and dark clothing, and Vikings loved bright colors, and they were very clean people. We know a fair amount about naval battles because there's quite a bit of detail in the sources on how Vikings fought at sea. But what was laughably funny about this clip was the people doing the throwing. So there's 2 specialized spears that seem to be for naval battle in the Viking Age. One of them is snarespjot, a stringed spear. We can increase the range immensely and put a lot more power into the spear by throwing it with a string wrapped around the spear. And so it's, I would have expected to see these throwing strings. The other spear is just a long, overgrown spear, a spear on steroids. And rather than throwing, it was more used for jabbing as the ships approached. The ships approach side to side, and that's not the way Vikings did it. They approached bow to bow, so front to front, and once they had touched, they'd grapple, they'd pull themselves in. That's when the battle really began in earnest. Their goal was to go the full length of the ship to kill the person in the stern. So it was like a land battle fought on a floating island, the deck of a ship. You're forcing your way through, throwing everything off to the sides, forcing their way through to get to the king. Can you imagine the kind of courage it took to do this and the word glory you would achieve if you did, in fact, kill the king? So that part of the battle was pretty far off. I really expected to see a lot more of that kind of motion in a naval battle. Because they had no shields, they were using their swords as a defense. And the way they use their swords is as if they believe that no matter what you do, they're not going to break. While Viking swords had a lot of strength, if you do edge-on-edge contact, very likely you're going to create some sort of chip, and subsequent hits are going to cause that crack to propagate along the length of the blade, and the blade is going to break. And Vikings were very sensitive to that. So the funeral we see in this clip is every person's preconceived idea of what a Viking funeral was like, but not in any way supported by any source. Some Vikings were put into a boat or a ship, and the ship was buried, and the whole thing covered over. Some Vikings were put into a ship or a boat and burned, but it was always done on land. Suppose you did set a ship on fire, send it out, it's going to burn to the water line, the sea is going to put out the fire, and the remnants are going to drift back to land. That's not going to be very pretty. I'm going to have to rate this clip somewhere around the 5, only for the fight. The fight had the power and the intensity and the relentlessness that we would expect to see in Vikings. My favorite Viking movie to date would have to be The Northman. The creative team that put this together did a lot of research, consulted with a lot of experts, and they bring Viking life to the screen in a very accurate representation. Not perfect, but it's quite amazing and head and shoulders above any other Viking film I know. If you like this video, why not click on the next one?